we all know this scenario where we can't move forward, the client has to make a call, and now effectively everybody's waiting for that decision to be made, and everything just comes to a halt while that's happening, right? Optimizing decision making has to be one of those really important factors that has to be taken into consideration, which you would not be able to properly place into a schedule.
You've got to pivot, but you've got to know when to fail fast as well. So this isn't working, you fail fast, go back to the drawing board, but at the same time continue to deliver. So the organizational structure shouldn't impact the day-to-day delivery. It's that continuing to hit the vision, the North Star, in an efficient manner and being able to pivot with external, with internal influences. That's where you test the organization.
My brain started to kind of go, well, they drill a couple holes per day, but then you have a Giga project. So it's probably a lot of holes spread around lots of sites. And that goes to some sort of progress meeting. And then that progress meeting updates another progress meeting, which updates another progress meeting. And then eventually somewhere, someplace, which is how it always works, there's someone who's looking at like 10 milestones and it's like, yes, my $1 trillion project is on time.
I've learned the concept of scaling. First in physics, when you have things like nuclear reactions where they scale exponentially. And then you have the concept of scaling in venture capitalism, which is, how do you exponentially grow a business? It's very, very difficult, I found, for humans to think non-linearly, but it's a skill you have to develop. It's not inherent. But this is scaling to a mega extent. So
Hi, folks. A quick one before we dive into this week's episode. Our book, The Critical Path Career, How to Advance in Construction and Planning and Scheduling, is out now, and you can order it on Amazon. We'll include a link below. This is a great way to show support for the Beyond Deadlines podcast, and Greg and I have worked extremely hard taking everything we know in our 30 years of experience, plus everything we've picked up from shooting this podcast, and we've tried to pack it into an information-dense book that you can use right away. In the book, we have specific strategies on how to get a raise, how to get a promotion, and find a new job. We include 26 of the best interview questions that we have come across, in addition to 34 specific impact ideas that you can go use on your projects today. We want to thank everyone who's shown us support so far and enjoy this week's episode. Welcome to the Beyond Deadlines podcast, where we tackle challenges that planning and schedule leaders come across on a day-to-day basis. My name is Micah. I'm a planning and scheduling manager.
My name is Greg Lawton. I'm the CEO of an AI scheduling management company called Nodes and Links. And today we have Paul and Athar.
My name is Athar Syed. I'm a project controls and program management professional.
Hi, Paul Callender. I'm a program management director specializing in delivering major programs of work around the world.
Beautiful. So today we have some project royalty with us. We have two individuals who specialize in setting up billion-dollar and in some cases trillion-dollar projects, looking at how you think about organization, structure, teamwork, governance, and everything that sits under there. Both Paul and Athar have got decades and decades of experience between them, and today's episode is not going to be a hypothetical. Today's episode is actually going to be Micah and I asking Paul and Athar how you actually go about doing this. Because believe it or not, Micah and I have not set up trillion-dollar projects yet. There's time, though. There's time. So, Paul, welcome to the podcast. First question, how do you even start to get your head round setting up, let's just say $100 billion contract. Let's keep it small for now. How do you even get your head round setting that kind of organization up?
What I've found is working through having worked on smaller jobs and then slowly progressing towards much larger jobs, was the establishment of a framework to make sense of the situation that you're in and then act accordingly in terms of setting up an organization. So the process that I'm currently following and have been trying to develop over these recent years is you go through a process of defining what the need is in terms of what is the scope and what is, very importantly, the context within which you're delivering it. And then essentially looking at what are the aspects of your project organization that have to be brought up to meet that need. I define the project organization in broad terms in terms of people, processes, systems, and the agreements that bind the people and the groups together. And the specific areas of performance that I'm looking at are strategy, capability, capacity, decision making, monitoring and control, communication, and motivation. Those would be the 7 areas that you want to look at. And the measure of performance, or how do you know if the organization is doing well, the attributes that you're looking for are compliance, robustness, effectiveness, efficiency, and resilience. So that in broad terms is the framework. And I'm finding that if you look at it in those parameters, that would be the basis upon which you start figuring out how do you start setting that up. It's a framework that can be applied to smaller jobs, but increasingly, as the industry is moving towards larger and more complex jobs, mega projects and now giga jobs, it is as essential to be looking at the team as it is to be looking at the execution plan itself. As planners, and I started as a planner, you tend to be very focused on that, the critical path and focusing on what is critical right now and really getting that done. And that's a tried and tested method, which doesn't take away from what I'm saying. But as the complexity of the job and the complexity of the organizations that have to be put together to deliver job increases, you really need to approach organizational setup in a much more thoughtful and diligent way. And the framework that I just laid out is the basis that you would approach that would allow you to try to do that in an effective way.
Beautiful. So I've got so many questions, but I'll start with this one. So I'm learning a new framework, listening to you here in my mind, but I haven't sat down and built that framework for $100 billion, $500 billion job. Help me imagine if, let's say, I'm sitting on a job that's 50 million. I would imagine that all of those components exist, but at different levels of importance and different levels of depth of capability.
Uh-huh.
How does the importance and the depth change as the size or national importance or whatever it is of the actual project grows?
If we just go back a step, sorry. So most of these projects or these giga projects aren't just hatched like an egg. There's years and years of, prior planning that goes into it. So what generally happens is you influence this through that RFP stage or through the project initiation stage as well. So you're already developing kind of rapid deployment teams, resourcing these people, putting plans together, execution plans. And that's part of your success factor is I've got the best project execution plan. And on this particular project that we can't talk about, this was taking 6 months at least to put that together before you even get to the client's office. And then you're resourcing all the way through that. So you do have a kind of a 90-day plan that you've developed as part of that tender stage or as part of your pitch that we're putting on the table. And that, as Athar says, that gives you that framework. Then you test that framework and you mature the organization as you're recruiting, as you're resourcing, as you're assimilating data. And the key thing is that rapid assimilation of data, which you've done through the specification, the scope and the tender and everything else. But then as soon as you hit the ground running, you've really got to get people in there and remove any kind of barriers to how you get to the number of that data.
Yeah. I think, and I'll add to that, Greg. I mean, it's even when you go from, mega to giga or you're going up the scale, the basic functions are still the same. You're still going to have planning. You're still going to have costs. You're still going to have document control. What you're looking at, though, is the size of the scope. So to some extent, that one is actually more measurable in terms of I've got this much workload to do, and therefore I've got some heuristic or some baseline upon which I can do an extrapolation and figure out, okay, if I need to do this amount of work, I need these many people, I need these many elements. But what I think also has to be taken into consideration is that as the size of the organization grows, and generally larger programs, larger complexity, even though you are fulfilling the same function, the complexity of that function is actually going up, right? And therefore, it's not only a matter of capacity. So if you remember, I talked about capacity and capability. Those will go up relatively linearly to the scope and size of the job. But what you're not perhaps taking into consideration, or often is not taken into consideration, is that comms is a lot more complex when I've got a 50-person planning team versus a 5 planning team. Monitoring is a lot more complicated when I've got multiple work fronts and multiple projects which are being executed in tandem in a program than it is on a single project, right? The decision making is a lot harder. I actually would consider the capability and the capacity mapping to be the relatively easier part of scaling up a job, right? Because you're still talking about the same function and you have some sort of measure towards workload in that. What is much harder to quantify and much harder to address is that the other factors are getting more complicated, and trying to figure out how to optimize those so that you still get a much larger team. And bear in mind, larger teams, geographically distant teams, because we are increasingly working towards multiple offices in remote locations. They have to interact with one another. You have much more stakeholders, potentially multiple client-side stakeholders who have potentially different needs. So it's those complexities which actually become much, much harder, and they actually scale up much faster than the pure capability capacity ones, which tend to go somewhat more linear.
Got it. Okay, and give me a little rope with what the route that I'm about to go down, because I'm actually learning as we're going on here, and I'm going through my own learning process. So I'm trying to bucket things into 2 domains. The first domain, and actually, Paul, it comes from what you're saying, and Athar, both yourselves. What I'm hearing is incredibly structured thinking, and incredibly structured thinking comes from, for example, being a scheduler, or being a cost manager, or being an engineer. And it's essentially just refining that ability to think in a very structured and logical way to an element of extreme. And then the second bucket are themes and topics that you wouldn't pick up in those domains unless you hit a certain level of seniority. So, for example, if I'm starting out as a scheduler, I immediately start to learn about the integration of activities and the coding of activities and elements of governance around there. But what I'm not learning about is the complexity mapping of team structures, communication structures, capability networks, these kinds of things. Where is that tipping point where in your careers you started to learn about all of these additional topics on top of planning and engineering?
For me, it's actually quite clear. So in the thousands, I worked in projects in Iraq, right? So even though I went in primarily as a planner and then I moved into effectively the full range of project controls, I used to primarily be based in Kuwait, overseeing multiple relatively small projects, but a whole bunch of them all through Iraq. And at the time, Iraq was a war zone, right? I think that for me was really the eye opener in terms of where it was beyond just the scheduling discipline or the function, right? But actually figuring out, hang on a second, we have teams all over the place. Travel is difficult and dangerous, right? How do you address the comms problem? How do you address the decision making problem where you have a client that sits in Palace and Baghdad? We have various sites all over Iraq. Some of them are accessible, some are not accessible. To me, that's where really the comms, the monitoring and control, the decision making, all of those started becoming more apparent that, those are the factors that are really affecting our ability to deliver. Because if you pull the schedule for like 10 substations we did in various locations in Iraq, the schedule is a pretty normal schedule. It goes through the normal sequence of events that you would go to build a substation. It would be no different than if you were building that same substation anywhere else on the planet, right? But there was a lot more organizational aspect to it. There was a logistical aspect to it. There was a new element of security to it, which were all organizational in nature, but were as relevant to delivering those projects successfully as the actual core disciplines of cost, schedule and document control and reporting and all of those things. So to me, that was where that started. And then I followed that with a systems engineering degree. And so that really started getting me thinking more in terms of holistically looking at program delivery, not just purely in terms of the core disciplines of project controls or project management.
Yeah, I think I'm very, very blessed to have worked in countries with many different cultures. But I think for me, it's failure. You learn from your failures. That's fundamental. How we got to this place is that we've been through this. We've burnt our fingers, and you know that some things don't work. And especially when you're dealing with diverse cultures and languages and and even the climate. You've got to change the way you think and operate. Logistics is totally different when you're in a greenfield zone in the middle of the desert. I mean, how do you do that? So you've got to look back and where have you experienced it? If you haven't, then you find the person that has, and you network through the team of that. That's really how I've got to where I am. And that's what I was talking about, standing on the shoulders of others, because that's what you do. You understand how it all comes together, but I don't know how you would do a logistics solution in the middle of nowhere. So you find somebody who does, and you bring them into that pack.
This is interesting because to me, part of this almost seems like you're setting up a company, but you're doing it in like a very short runway, like the classic James Bond film where the plane barely takes off before the end of the runway. When we look at setting up something like that, what are some of those tactics and strategies that keeps the culture moving forward? Because I just picture this scenario. You're like day 0, you have like 2 people. Day 120, you have like, I don't know, 500, right? Something like that. But often that culture shifts and moves how things go. So how do you maintain some sort of consistency there? I mean, you mentioned comms, but what are the tactics there behind the actual comms? Is it a hierarchical scheme? Are you just regular sending out like emails? Like what's really driving that piece to maintain some consistency across your projects?
There's no one answer to that, is it? I mean, I think we tested, so with the governance and the organizational development, we tried it one way, it didn't work, we tried it another way. You've got to pivot, but you've got to know when to fail fast as well. So this isn't working, you fail fast, go back to the drawing board, but at the same time, continue to deliver. So the organizational structure shouldn't impact the day-to-day delivery as long as that delivery is set out in the schedules and people understand what their day-to-day job is. It's that continuing to hit the vision, the North Star, in an efficient manner and being able to pivot with external influences, with internal influences. That's where you test the organization. And I think, the organizations that Athar's put together really is testament to that by looking at, where is this not working? And you have a maturity curve. We're not there. Why aren't we there? Let's improve and look back and step back from that. But you're also building a team that's previous. Sorry, Arthur. You're always working with a team that usually in something where you are recruiting, tens of thousands of people on something like this size. They've all worked with each other before. It's a small but large family. The mega project program management, project management fraternity. So you know whether these people are going to work. If they recommend somebody, they work with them and they've delivered something before, and they have a track record for that.
Yeah, and I'll add to that it's certainly helpful to be able to pull people who work together. But I mean, a comm strategy is always going to be a layered strategy. There's not one solution. You're actually layering different mechanisms for communication, and knowing full well that some are going to land better than others. So to example, intranet site to pull everybody together to have one place where people can refer. Town hall meetings to make sure that you're interacting, standards and terminology documentation and getting those formalized, right? So that we're all speaking the same language. Increasingly, a lot of that is sort of just embedded into your information systems as well, because leveraging information systems effectively gives you an opportunity to get everybody working within the same environment. And so rather than trying to teach everybody the correct, form to use, you just sort of fully embed that into a workflow in your ERP system. So these are all complementary mechanisms to make sure that people all start aligning towards the same language, and then of course ultimately to the same vision. And again, I would highlight the difficulty that you're going to face is going to vary. So if, for example, you're delivering a mega project in one established jurisdiction, like in the United States, right? If you're working in the United States, everybody you're going to pull in most likely will be from there, and they will already have a certain commonality in terms of culture, understanding, and the context within we're executing. On the other hand, if you're doing like a multinational job in a location that attracts a lot of people from all over the world, like the Middle East, you actually have to put in extra effort. And I've realized that sitting in a meeting that, you have somebody from the States, somebody from the UK, somebody from Australia, and you can tell, oh, they're not really communicating. They're not really making sense to one another. They're all speaking English, but they're not actually aligning and understanding. You have to sort of work on that to make sure that, hang on, this is what we mean in this particular context. On this particular job, this is what we're going to define the terms and this is what the terminology is going to mean. This is how we're going to all work together. And that has to be worked on. If you don't put an effort into it, a team that interacts with one another for long enough organically will develop that as well. But if you're pushing towards higher efficiency, higher performance, you have to actually take it seriously uh, and address it more proactively so that you get better performance with your team faster.
Yeah, well, you don't know where organically that's going to go either.
True.
If you let that develop, I mean, it will develop, but you don't know what it's going to do. Go ahead, Greg.
I was just thinking there of condensing, because there's a huge amount of experience and knowledge and thinking in what you guys have just said. I was just trying to think how to condense some of the elements, and I just wanted to test some of those ideas with you, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong on these. So the first one is something that I actually tell to some of my team inside Nodes and Links is your job is not to, for example, deliver the project. Your job is to build the machine and the organization that is suited to deliver the project. So you're not taking the weight of 100 billion on your shoulders. You're taking the weight of a management structure of 60 people that will then form 1,000 people, which will then form 20,000 people, which will then deliver 100 billion. And that to me just makes it more relatable, and it actually makes it feel achievable.
Mm-hmm.
If you told me, spend $1 billion a week or something, I'd be like, I have no idea how to do that. But I'm sure 1,000 cost, procurement people could. Is that an accurate set of statements?
In some ways, yeah. I think, as Micah alluded to as well, you've got the culture. So you start with an organization, you don't know where it's going to end up. The culture, and especially the management style from different cultures, impacts that. So in the Middle East, the governance around payments and around contract management is slightly different to the governance you might have in America, because you have trusted systems, whereas in the Middle East, there is the perception that bribery and corruption is everywhere. So you've got additional kind of checks and balances. So if you went in there with an American payment system or process, you're definitely going to fail and you're not going to get there. So you've got to build it to be scalable from day one, but make sure the checks and balances that are in there are right. I remember working in Dubai, some of the payment terms are 120 days, but that's costing into the job. You do that from the beginning. So the contractor's going, yeah, it's fine. I get paid in 120 days. So my prices are inflated by 120 days of interest. Whereas in US, it's like the efficiency of not borrowing money is, I want to get paid every 24 hours, or I want to get paid every 7 days, or whatever it is. So there's different horses, different courses, and how you then govern that payment system. But if you're paying from a central client who is based in the Middle East, those rules will apply across the world from that. So then you've got to communicate that and set expectations.
I think something you said as well leads me on to a second idea. So Micah and I recorded an episode where I talked about how one of my passions is actually moving project management, which is fundamentally a social science because it sits under the pillar of business, into more of a hard science because, well, you know this, we've talked about a lot, my background's in physics and engineering. But I'm going to humble myself a little bit here, where it's, you can't make a whale a bird. So project management is a social science. There are components of it that are hard sciences. For example, how long it takes to drill a hole, you can stand there with a stopwatch and you can measure it. There's variance around that. But where you're starting, the starting point of what you just talked about, and Athar, what you were talking about before, is objectives and culture. And those are, I can't suddenly turn up with my culture-ometer and start measuring some physical culture. So if I just took you guys and threw you at a random place in the world, let's say I threw you in China or I threw you in Brazil or something like that, how would you start assessing the landscape to which you're standing on so that you can start to think about, what payment systems need to be put in place or what organizational structure needs to be put in place because of the underlying culture and the objectives that you're trying to achieve?
Well, let me start on that, because I think when you sort of gave that example of do a project in China or Brazil, right? So you immediately gave a context to it, right? Now, when you're defining need, and that needs to be your start, it's like, what am I building or what am I delivering and where am I delivering it? And both of those factors have to be taken into consideration because to go back to my earlier example, a substation in New Jersey is very different than a substation in Najaf, Iraq. It might be the exact same design, but the context is entirely different. And then that context will already start answering some factors which are already embedded in that particular context. Like, depending on which area you're operating in, there are certain rules that are already there and they are immovable. Your task is to figure out what is it about the context which is already established and cannot be messed with, right? And what are the areas which are actually not defined and then there can be moved around. A lot of time can be wasted trying to implement something from a different context in a place where it's simply not going to work. On the other hand, you should always be open to it because you're like, hang on, maybe I can bring in a new way of doing something which hasn't been considered before. And this is where I would agree with you. That's the social part of it, right? Because if I just took those two basic elements of defining the need, the scope is probably the tangible part. Like I need to build something and I have the design, therefore I can do the analysis on how much material I need and even how many people I will need to be able to do that, more or less, right? But you have to marry that with the context because if it's a more established place, I can maybe do it with fewer people and more systems. But if it's not a very established place, maybe I'm just going to do the same thing with more people. So if you remember, I talked earlier about what are the elements of the organization, people, process, systems, and then the agreements that bind them together. You can play with those, right? You can say, oh, I'll achieve the same outcome with more people in this context because they're easily available and they're cheaper to do that here. But in this other place where, let's say, manpower cost is higher, I'm actually going to push more towards systems and therefore reduce my manpower cost. So, but it has to start with knowing what your need is, which is your scope and your context. And then on the other end of the spectrum is the actual organization and playing around with those levers of people, process, systems so that you can get that match. And how do you figure that match? It's those things that we talked about in the middle: capability, capacity, monitoring and control, decision making. So this is embedded in all of that analysis are tangibles. Like you said, if you're just talking about drilling the hole, that's measurable. You know what tool you need, you know how long you need to do that, et cetera, et cetera. You can calculate that. But if I've got to drill thousands of holes in different places, now I've got to factor in how am I going to get myself aligned? Am I doing it in the right sequence? That's where my schedule comes in. How am I measuring performance? Then I've got to have some other, perhaps very manual systems of people taking record, like quantity surveyors walking around, or we go to the opposite end extreme, where we're going right now with effectively drones, which are measuring progress. Again, you are playing with systems, processes, and people in various combinations to get the objectives that you want. I don't know if that answers your question, but it sort of is the approach you have to take to be looking at each aspect of what you're trying to deliver and figuring out what combination best suits this need, taking into consideration the context within which I'm operating.
You know, it may not answer the question, but it'll give us more questions. Hey folks, hate to cut this conversation off short, but this episode is part of a two-part series. So next week, we're going to dive into the second part. We'll see you then.